Hello everyone, I wanted to make an introduction before moving on to the video. The channel's interactions are a little low, so I'm asking you to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and state your opinion in the comments. Thank you very much in advance. The evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the deserted platform of Greywood Station. It was an old, forgotten place, mostly ignored by travelers, except for those caught in the throes of desperation. Ethan, a weary commuter, found himself waiting for the last train home. The station's flickering lights cast an eerie glow, and the air felt heavy with a chill that made him shiver. Ethan glanced at his watch. It was well past midnight, and the only sound was the distant rustle of leaves outside. He was about to check his phone when he heard the faint sound of a train approaching, the rhythmic clatter growing louder as it drew near. Relieved, he stepped closer to the edge of the platform. As the train screeched to a halt, its doors slid open with an unsettling creak. The interior was dimly lit, shadows dancing across the worn seats. Ethan hesitated for a moment. There were no other passengers. Should he board a train at this hour, especially one that seemed so out of place? But the thought of waiting alone in the station was even more unnerving. He stepped inside, and the door hissed shut behind him. The train jolted forward, plunging into darkness as it left the station. Ethan settled into a seat, the fabric rough against his skin, and tried to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. The train rattled down the tracks, the monotonous sound lulling him into a restless state. As he stared out the window, the landscape blurred into an indistinct smear of darkness. It felt as if the train was entering a void, and for a moment, he questioned if he had made the right choice. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He turned to see a figure at the far end of the car, a woman, dressed in a long, tattered coat, her face obscured by shadows. She was staring intently at him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as she began to walk toward him, her steps deliberate and slow. Ethan swallowed hard, instinctively wanting to shrink away. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice wavering. She stopped just a few feet away, the dim light revealing a gaunt face with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through him. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice low and raspy. "This train doesn't stop." Confusion washed over Ethan. "What do you mean?" "This is the last train, right? It goes to Ashford." Her expression shifted to one of pity, and she shook her head slowly. "No one who boards this train ever arrives." Before he could respond, the train lurched violently, and the lights flickered again. The woman staggered, and Ethan's heart raced. He glanced at the window. Darkness enveloped everything, swallowing the scenery outside. Panic gripped him as he realized the train was picking up speed, far beyond any normal pace. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, rising to his feet. "Where are we going?" "The lost go to the lost," she murmured, her voice fading as she stepped back into the shadows. He could barely see her now, but he felt her gaze, cold and knowing. The train rattled violently, and the lights began to flicker more erratically. The air grew thick, and a heavy fog rolled in from the windows, distorting everything. He stumbled back to his seat, trying to calm his racing heart. He reached for his phone, desperate to contact someone, but the screen remained black, unresponsive. In that moment, the train's lights went out entirely, plunging him into complete darkness. Panic surged as he struggled to breathe. "Hello, is anyone there?" He shouted into the void, his voice swallowed by the darkness. Then, just as suddenly, the lights flickered back on. The woman was gone, but the train was no longer empty. A handful of shadowy figures now occupied the seats around him, their faces indistinguishable. They seemed to be staring at him, their expressions vacant yet somehow filled with dread. The train jolted again, and a loud, echoing screech filled the air. He felt an overwhelming sense of dread. "What's happening?" he shouted, but no one responded. Instead, the figures began to whisper among themselves, their voices blending into a cacophony of despair. As Ethan clutched the armrest, he felt a sudden chill brush against his skin. One of the figures leaned closer, the dim light illuminating their face pale, gaunt, and disturbingly familiar. It was him, or rather, a version of himself, hollow-eyed and filled with sorrow. "You can't escape," the apparition rasped. "We are all lost here." The train lurched again, and the figures began to dissolve into mist, leaving only their haunting whispers echoing in his ears. Panic took hold, and Ethan leapt to the door, slamming against it in desperation. "Stop the train, let me off." But the doors remained sealed tight, and the train hurtled forward, faster than he could comprehend. The lights flickered wildly again, and in that chaos, he saw a glimpse of what lay outside. Shadows darted past, twisted forms of despair and anguish. The woman's voice echoed again, clearer now. "You will join us. There is no return." Ethan's heart sank as he felt the overwhelming pull of the darkness, as if the train itself was a vortex, pulling him into its depths. With one last effort, he closed his eyes and willed himself to escape this nightmare. When the train emerged from the darkness, everything changed. The lights were back, the passengers returned to their seats, and the platform ahead was illuminated as if by day. But something was off. Ethan looked down at his hands, and they were translucent, barely there. He reached for the door, but it was no longer there. He was trapped. The last train continued its journey, carrying him to a destination unknown, a place where lost souls wandered in eternal darkness. The woman's voice whispered in his ear, and he finally understood. He was now one of them, forever riding the train that never stops, never arrives. The clock struck midnight as the last train pulled into Windsor Station. The platform was eerily quiet, save for the distant rumble of thunder. A thin mist rolled in, curling around the aged wooden benches, creating an unsettling atmosphere. Marcus, a seasoned traveler, stepped off the bus and found himself drawn to the train, its headlights piercing through the fog like ghostly eyes. He had missed the last bus home and didn't relish the thought of waiting until morning. The train appeared to be the only option. As he approached, the doors slid open with a hiss, inviting him into the dimly lit interior. The train was nearly empty. The few passengers seated in the rear car were cloaked in shadows, their faces obscured by the gloom. Marcus settled into a seat by the window, pulling out his phone to check for messages. Nothing. He felt a wave of isolation wash over him. As the train lurched forward, the lights flickered, momentarily plunging the car into darkness. He felt a shiver run down his spine. The air was thick, heavy with a sense of foreboding. He tried to shake it off and stared out the window. The landscape outside blurred into a murky void, the trees appearing like twisted silhouettes. About 15 minutes into the journey, Marcus noticed something odd. The same passengers he had seen earlier were still there, their positions unchanged. He dismissed it as fatigue, but a creeping unease settled over him. He glanced at the woman seated across the aisle, a pale figure in a long coat with dark, sunken eyes. She seemed to be watching him. "Where are you headed?" she whispered, her voice barely above the sound of the train wheels clattering against the tracks. "Just home," Marcus replied, forcing a smile. "You home," she echoed, her gaze unwavering. The train shook violently, and the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't come back on. Panic surged through Marcus as he fumbled for his phone, but it remained unresponsive. The darkness wrapped around him like a suffocating shroud. He could hear whispers now, soft and unintelligible, swirling in the void. Suddenly, the lights flared back to life, and Marcus squinted against the brightness. The woman was gone, and the other passengers had shifted now. They were all staring at him, their eyes hollow and empty, as if they were nothing but shadows. Heart racing, he stood up, ready to make his escape. "Excuse me, I need to get off," he shouted, but the door wouldn't budge. He pounded against it, desperation clawing at his throat. The train surged forward, gaining speed. He glanced out the window, but all he saw was an endless stretch of dark. "Help!" he yelled, but his voice seemed to fade into the shadows. Suddenly, the train lurched to a halt, throwing him against the seat. The lights flickered again, this time revealing a scene that froze him in place. The passengers were gone, replaced by twisted versions of himself, distorted reflections, their faces contorted in agony. "What is happening?" Marcus whispered, backing away. "You should not have come here," one of the figures hissed, its voice a distorted echo of his own. "We are the lost." With a horrifying clarity, Marcus understood. This train didn't just traverse physical space. It traversed time and fate, and he had boarded something far worse than a simple late-night train. The train was a purgatory, a vessel for those who had vanished without a trace. "Get off while you can," another version of him shouted, but it was too late. The train lurched again, and the interior warped around him, shifting like a nightmare. The lights dimmed once more, and in the flickering glow, he caught sight of the woman from earlier. She stood at the far end of the car, a sad smile on her lips. "You're one of us now," she said softly. With a cry, Marcus lunged toward her, but the distance felt impossibly vast. The train began to move again, faster this time, and the walls of the car closed in. The whispers swelled to a deafening roar, drowning out his thoughts. "Join us," they chanted, a chorus of despair. In a final attempt to escape, Marcus pressed against the window, willing himself to break through. But the glass was solid, unyielding. The reality of his situation sank in as the train barreled forward into a tunnel of darkness, the end nowhere in sight. The woman stepped closer, her form shimmering like a mirage. "We can't leave this place," she said, her voice echoing with a haunting sadness. "But we can keep you company." And as the train plunged deeper into the void, Marcus realized that he was trapped forever, a passenger on the Midnight Express, a ghost among the lost, destined to ride through the darkness with no hope of escape. It was the fall of 1983 when a peculiar incident occurred at Cedar Grove Station, a small, remote stop nestled in the hills of New England. The station had always been quiet, frequented mostly by locals who knew each other by name. But on that fateful night, a series of events would unfold that would haunt the town for decades. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie orange glow, a thick fog rolled in from the hills, enveloping the station in a shroud of mystery. Lucy, a college student traveling home for the weekend, arrived at Cedar Grove just before dusk. She was tired from her long day of classes and anxious to return to the warmth of her family home. The train she needed was scheduled to arrive at 8:15 p.m. Lucy checked her watch. 7:50 p.m. She noticed the old ticket booth was closed and the platform was deserted, save for a flickering streetlight that seemed to struggle against the encroaching darkness. As the minutes ticked by, she pulled her scarf tighter around her neck, feeling a chill that was unusual for early autumn. The air was thick with anticipation, as if something was about to happen. At 8:10 p.m., a low rumble echoed in the distance, growing louder until the sound of the approaching train filled the night. Lucy's heart lifted at the familiar sound. The train, known as the Midnight Flyer, had a reputation for being reliable, a comforting presence in the lives of Cedar Grove residents. But as the train emerged from the fog, she felt an unsettling chill run down her spine. The train looked different, darker, older. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside. When it came to a halt, the doors opened with a slow, creaking groan. Lucy hesitated for a moment, a feeling of dread washing over her. But she brushed it aside, convincing herself that it was simply her imagination. She stepped inside. The interior of the train was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of must and mildew. As she moved down the aisle, she noticed that the train was nearly empty. A few figures sat hunched in their seats, shrouded in shadow. She tried to catch their eyes, to share a smile, but they remained fixated on the floor, as if they were waiting for something. Lucy chose a seat by the window and settled in, glancing out at the fog that obscured the view. The train lurched forward, and she felt a wave of relief wash over her, but that relief was short-lived. The train began to rattle violently, and she could hear the sound of metal grinding against metal. The lights flickered overhead, and a voice crackled over the intercom. "Next stop, Millington." Lucy frowned. Millington was not her destination. She glanced at the other passengers, but they remained unresponsive. A knot of anxiety formed in her stomach. "Excuse me," she called out to the figure seated across the aisle, a man dressed in a long, dark coat. "Is this the right train?" He turned his head slowly, revealing a gaunt face with hollow eyes. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "This train doesn't take you where you want to go." Panic surged within her. She stood up, ready to make her way to the door, but it was already locked. The train sped up, and the scenery outside the window began to distort, the trees morphing into dark, twisted shapes. "Help!" she shouted, but her voice was drowned out by the cacophony of the train's machinery. She pounded on the door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and for a brief moment, she saw them, the other passengers. Their faces were no longer shadowed. They looked gaunt and pale, eyes wide with terror. It was as if they were all trapped in a shared nightmare. "Get off," one of them cried out. "You have to get off before it's too late." "What are you talking about?" Lucy shouted, her voice breaking. "Where are we going?" The train rumbled violently, and the intercom crackled to life again. Next stop, the abyss. Fear coursed through her veins. "What is the abyss?" she cried, but no one answered. The passengers were now shifting, their bodies trembling as if they were bracing for impact. Without warning, the train lurched again, and everything went dark. When the lights returned, Lucy found herself alone. The car was empty, the oppressive silence swallowing her whole. The train continued its relentless journey, and she stumbled down the aisle, searching for an exit, for anyone who could help her. As she passed through the empty car, she noticed something strange: a series of photographs pinned to the walls. Each photo depicted a different passenger, their faces filled with joy and life. But beneath each photograph was a date, and all of them were from years past, some even decades ago. "Why are these here?" she murmured, feeling a chill creep up her spine. Suddenly, she recognized one of the faces. It was the man in the dark coat. The train lurched once more, and a voice echoed through the car, chilling her to the bone. "Welcome to your final ride," Lucy screamed, the sound echoing through the empty train as she frantically searched for a way out. Just then, the train began to slow, and she could see the faint glow of lights in the distance. It was Millington. Desperate, she ran to the door, pounding on it with all her might. "Let me out," she screamed. The train came to a halt, and the doors slid open. She bolted out into the night, stumbling onto the platform. But as she turned to look back, the train was gone, vanished into the fog as if it had never been there. Breathing heavily, she glanced around. The platform was eerily silent, with no signs of life. As she took a shaky step forward, she spotted a small newspaper stand nearby. The headlines were yellowed and faded, but one caught her eye: "Train disappears without a trace, passengers missing." Heart pounding, she realized the truth. The midnight flyer had not just taken her somewhere else. It had taken her to the edge of reality itself. She was one of the lucky ones, having escaped. But as she looked around the deserted station, she understood that Cedar Grove would never be the same again. In the months that followed, strange occurrences began to plague the town. Residents reported hearing the sound of a train whistling in the night, accompanied by the whispers of lost souls. Many who had traveled on the midnight flyer began to vanish, leaving only their photographs behind, captured in time, forever waiting for the next train that might never come. And so, the legend of the vanishing train grew, a haunting tale that echoed through Cedar Grove, a warning to all who dared to step onto the tracks. Lucy knew she had escaped, but the chilling truth lingered. The train would return, and when it did, it would be hungry for more souls to join its eternal journey through the darkness. Alright everyone, that brings us to the end of our story. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more content like this, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. And if you have similar stories you'd like to share with us, feel free to reach out. Thank you for watching, and until next time, take care.